introduce Eben Goodstein. He is a mover and shaker in the world of sort of environmental policy, and sort of he's taken this program at Bard College and really made it grow. He's sort of nationally recognized for his efforts. And so I've been to a number of meetings, and he always talks really eloquently at these meetings. And I've known people who've gone through his program. And when he mentioned that he was going to be in the Boston area, I said, "Oh, we got to grab him." So I'm really excited. I haven't heard this talk, so I'm really excited to hear this talk, and I hope you all enjoy it. He's agreed to stay after a little bit after his talk if you want to talk about his program or just careers in general. So thank you very much for coming, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, look like maybe I can join the Secret Service and kind of straighten things out in the White House. So, how's that? Is that working? Okay, it doesn't look, okay. Did I just turn it off? Okay, good. All right, excellent. Well, thanks for having me here. I'm glad we could provide a scoop on Harvard. That's always a good thing, you know, be ahead of the game a little bit. So it's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you guys today. And let me just quickly scan. So how many of you all are first-year students here? Sophomores and juniors and seniors, a lot of seniors, grad students and other. Okay, so there's some other here. Great. So I am going to talk about climate policy. I'm also want to sort of set it in the context of the moment that we're living in, and also talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at Bard to sort of frame this up. And in particular, I'm going to sort of mix up kind of a conversation about climate. Oh, that doesn't work. That's what I have to do. Okay. I'm going to mix up a conversation with climate policy, a little bit about how you can think about building yourself a career sort of saving the planet. And before I get into that, let me just say that, you know, we don't really have to worry about the planet. You know, it'll be fine. So that's kind of the good news. You know, if you give it a couple million years, and sort of no matter what we manage to do over the next 100 or so, as George Carlin once said, it'll just shake us off like a bad case of fleas. So, you know, the planet's going to be fine. We can put ourselves at rest there. But what we're really talking about is, you know, creating a livable future for our kids and grandkids. Because we are living at a truly extraordinary moment in the history of the human project, right? In the sense that the work that, if you are going to pursue a career in sustainability, the work you're going to do over the next 30 years is going to profoundly impact the future. And not only of your own life and the lives of your children, but in fact for every human being and every creature that's going to walk the face of the planet from now until the end of time. You know, it seems like an ordinary day out there, but it really isn't going to be an ordinary day for the rest of your lives. I mean, we're living at a point where 10,000 years of human history have kind of crashed into the next 3 decades. And folks who pursue careers in this area have got to figure out, okay, how are we going to meet the needs of 10 billion people in a world where conflicts over water and oil and topsoil and fish and forests and biodiversity and other resources are already real and escalating, and the planet's getting hotter all the time, right? So I am 54. You guys are 20-something, right? So there's 30 years between us, and I tend to think in terms of that 30-year gap. So 30 years from now, it will be the year 2044. I will be an old man. I'll be 84. You guys will be my age. And at that point, we're really going to know the future of the Earth in a very profound way, right? We're going to know whether we got the job done around feeding those 10 billion people, but we're going to know more fundamentally how hot it's going to get, and whether global warming is going to drive the planet 4 degrees Fahrenheit hotter or 12 degrees Fahrenheit hotter within your lifetimes. And I always put that number in perspective. During the last ice age, when this particular building was covered by over 1,000 feet of ice, the world was only 9 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it is right now. So, you know, what that means is that, you know, it's really up to the people in this room who are going to dedicate their lives to changing that future to decide where we're going to wind up. And to hold global warming to the low end, we have to rewire the entire world with clean energy, redesign cities across the Earth, reimagine the global food system. In doing all that, create tens of millions of jobs, help lift billions of people out of poverty. But more fundamentally, over the next 3 decades, figure out how to replace profitability and growth with sufficiency and sustainability at the heart of what we're doing on this planet, whether we're running businesses, government agencies, NGOs, or whatever. Okay? So congratulations to all of you for being in this room. I know that many people don't want to even hear about this. They'd just rather go home, drink a beer. But that's kind of the world we live in. It's the moment we're at, right? And it's exciting. It's an extraordinary time to really be alive because in many ways, this is the most human and decisive time to ever be alive. I mean, your generation has an opportunity that no other generation has had before to really shape the future of the Earth. And if you do this kind of work, you know you're doing it with millions of other people. So, this is important, what we're talking about today. It's profoundly important. Again, just to frame up what I'll talk about maybe a little more towards the end, if you want to pursue work kind of saving the planet, broadly speaking, there's three buckets that you can do that in. One is education, sort of broadly defined, and by that I mean not just being a teacher or a professor or a researcher, but also being a preacher or an imam or a rabbi or a journalist or an artist, anybody whose job it is to communicate the moral and scientific dimensions of the sustainability challenges we face. So that's bucket number one. Bucket number two is policy that we're going to talk about today, right? And a policy job, a career in policy is about a career changing the rules, right? And those rules get set at the international level, the UN. We'll be talking about national policy today, but also within cities and towns, within states, also within companies. So, every big company now today has got a chief sustainability officer. Tufts has got sustainability directors. Those people's jobs are policy jobs, right? They're trying to change the rules within those organizations to green those operations and make them more sustainable, right? So policy jobs are not just working in and around government or NGOs trying to influence government, but also within business or within NGOs trying to influence business, right? So Greenpeace and others spend a lot of time trying to influence what Citibank and other big businesses are doing. Okay, so that's bucket number two is policy. Bucket number three is business. And we don't tend to think about business as being part of the solution in kind of the environmental space because historically it's been thought of as the problem, right? Businesses produce stuff, they pollute, and when they get away with it, they exploit workers because that lowers their costs and they're in a competitive environment and they want to externalize social and environmental costs. But beginning about 20 years ago and really picking up steam in the last 10 or so, there's been this different idea that's emerged that, instead of looking at environmental and social problems as costs to be externalized, can we look at them as opportunities to be profitably solved, right? And this is this idea of sustainable business. Ultimately, if we're going to solve the problems that we face, we've got to have a mix of smart policy in which sustainable business can grow and actually deliver on the promises that policy is demanding. So if the government says we got to cut emissions 80%, ultimately it's business that has to respond creatively to that policy framework, and you need a synergy of the two. So at Bard, we have graduate programs in sustainability that really try to marry those, or they don't marry them, but they sort of acknowledge the need for both sides. And so we offer MS degrees in environmental policy and climate science and policy in our Annandale campus north of New York City. And then also a new MBA in sustainability down in New York City. And I can talk a little bit more maybe about those towards the end of the talk and the structure of those. And if you'd like to learn more, I've got a lot of information. I'm glad to chat with you afterwards. I also want to invite you all to come to Bard December 5th through 7th. We have a program there that we run called the C2C Fellows Leadership Training Program. And we run weekend training workshops for folks who want to learn more about how I can actually lead to change, whether it's in policy and politics or in business. Cooper's been there. He came last year. He can tell you about it. And it's a fantastic weekend. You're there with 50 or 60 other young people from across the Northeast. It's only $30. We feed you. We put you up. And basically teach you the skills that you're not necessarily getting in college that you're going to need if you want to step quickly into leadership positions. What you need to do, because we don't have a lot of time, to change the trajectory down which we're heading. So that's by way of kind of long introduction to get into this conversation about climate policy. And again, just to frame this up a little bit, you know, a lot of people are kind of sensing we're at a tipping point, you know, where we've been in a bit of a climate stalemate for 10 or 15 years in this country. And that not only do we have the president's climate policy in place, but we're at the march 2 weeks ago, 400,000 people in the street, and the scientific conversation about global warming just has a level of certainty that it just didn't have 5 or 6 years ago. So scientists used to say, you know, we can't blame any individual extreme weather event on global warming, just like we can't blame any individual lung cancer on cigarette smoking. But that conversation has really changed. There have been so many extreme weather events over the last 4 or 5 years globally that, you know, the conversation is basically now the planet's heated up 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years. You know, there's way more water in the atmosphere than there was 100 years ago. And all of this stuff is leading to, you know, more intense storms and longer and more intense droughts. Now, we can't say what percentage of that is due to climate change, but basically the signal of a hotter world is on every extreme weather event that we're seeing. So, you know, just if we go back 3 or 4 years, that was the massive flooding in the United States. That's a power plants that are completely surrounded by water in Nebraska. You know, unprecedented flooding in the Mississippi Basin. Got hit by the first of the tropical hurricanes, Irene, to hit this part of the world in 70 years. We had May and June. No, we had June and March, excuse me. June and March, not last winter, but 2 winters ago, or 3 winters ago, I think. Sort of, do you guys remember that? Sort of incredible sort of spell of summer in the middle of winter. Western forests are burning down. Just a dramatic increase in the scale and intensity of forest fires as that part of the world heats up and dries out. Those forests are not going to come back in the form in which many of us were sort of used to them, because the climate is not going to support that sort of a forest. It's going to be, you know, more of a less of a dense forest, more savanna-like environments. And then, of course, 2 years ago, we had, you know, unprecedented drought throughout the Midwest with dramatic impacts on our agricultural economy. Second tropical hurricane to hit the Northeast in 2 years. Last September, one of probably the strongest hurricane or typhoon to make landfall on record. Last fall, this was California in January. It's much worse now. The drought's persisting. And here's an amazing one, right? They've got great rainfall records in Britain going back well over 1,000 years. And this last winter, it was the wettest winter ever, historically, for the last 1,000 years, where we've got good records. And then it goes on. So this was August. And that's Business Week's take on all this. So not only is there a powerful consensus in the scientific community, but any business that has a dog in this fight that's dependent on climate is just very aware of the changing patterns that are driving trends in their business. And it's only warmed up 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, right? And we're locked into 3 times that much, and we might get 4 times that much. So that's, again, the backdrop. I'm always curious, how many of you guys have seen this slide before? Okay. It's amazing that more people have not. And I think it's a picture that everybody needs to see, and should be mandatory viewing for every high school student in this country, because it really kind of, in a frightening way, kind of illustrates where we're at. So this picture shows the last, actually goes back 400,000 years. And data is drawn from ice cores. So scientists drill down a mile into the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. They can pull the cores out. They can actually count the rings backwards, literally count them backwards, 400,000 years. And this red line shows temperatures at the time the ice was deposited in the Antarctic. And the blue line is the thickness of the carbon blanket that surrounds the atmosphere. And I don't need to tell you guys about that, I assume. So, you know, that's the cause of global warming, fundamentally pumping billions and billions of tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, heat trapping gas, light comes in, heat doesn't get out. That's why the planet's heating up. So what you see here is the Earth sliding into and out of ice ages. It's about a 100,000 year cycle. That's the last 10,000 years right there. That's the Holocene. That's the period of time during which human civilization developed. I mean, that's us right there, that little stretch. That's animal husbandry. That's the first cities, and right there, that's the iPod and the iPhone, right? It's all there. Everything is there in that little flat space. And humans have been the beneficiary not only of a remarkably stable warm period in climate history, but remarkably stable, right? The temperature has varied very, very little over the last 10,000 years. But you can see that we actually live on a planet that's subject to very large and extreme fluctuations in temperature, right? Again, the average temperature in the Ice Age is about 9 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it is right now. That's kind of where we're headed, you know? And this blue line is the thickness of the carbon blanket. And you can see that for the last 400,000 years, never been above 280 parts per million until now. And actually, this slide's 10 years old, so we're actually here. We're actually about 400 parts per million now, okay? And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that there's a really strong correlation here between the thickness of the carbon blanket, CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and global temperatures. The peaks and valleys line up almost perfectly, right? Now, that's a correlation. It's not a causal relationship, but we actually understand that relationship pretty well. So in the past, as the planet started to heat up, that's led to more CO2 in the atmosphere, thicker blanket, warmer planet, more CO2 in the atmosphere, thicker blanket, warmer planet, until the Ice Age cycle reversed itself, the planet starts to cool down, less CO2 in the atmosphere, thinner blanket, cooler planet, less CO2, thinner blanket, cooler planet. So prehistorically, and through the Ice Age cycles, carbon dioxide has acted as a positive feedback mechanism, you know, a forcing agent that has contributed dramatically to these very rapid swings in global temperature. What we're doing now is we're engaged in an unprecedented natural experiment where we're pumping billions and billions of tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's going up like crazy, and we're begging for the planet to heat up, and that's exactly what's happening, okay? So again, what is climate policy about, right? What is the purpose of climate policy? Well, it's to bend this curve, right? It's to get it to stop at 450, you know? Because if we don't, it's going to keep going up. There's no doubt about it. It's going to go up to 550, 650, 800, 1,000 parts per million is where it's headed. There's plenty of coal and oil in the ground to get us that high, okay? So that's the bottom line of what's at stake here. We know we can do this. The good news is this is really not a technical or economic problem. You know, economists have thought a lot about this, engineers, technologists. We know how to do this, right? So here's what we have to do. Right now, 2015, we're about 34 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And to solve the problem, well, here's where we go. This is where we're headed. Business as usual gets us to about twice that by 2050, and that's, you know, a recipe for planetary suicide in human terms. Alternatively, we can cut emissions to 14 billion tons by 2050, and then by the end of the century, essentially decarbonize our economy. Okay. Now, I just told you this is not an economic or technical problem, and you think that's crazy. How could we do that? But I challenge you to think, what was the major emission source from the transportation sector 100 years ago? What was the major pollution coming from transportation just before World War I? Not coal and trains, but horse poop. Horse poop, okay? That was the major pollution from transportation 100 years ago. We've definitely managed to reduce emissions of horse poop by well over 90% over the last 100 years, right? We did that. And that's all we got to do now. We went from horses to cars. We went from horses to cars. We got to go from cars to something else, and we know what that something else is, right? It's wind, solar, geothermal, biofuels, clean energy sources. And once you have that clean energy, then you can use it to run your vehicles on batteries or make hydrogen, run the hydrogen through the fuel cells, you know, sustainable biofuels. We're seeing Germany making rapid progress to decarbonize their economy. They're getting, on a good day, as much as 30 or 40% of their electricity from renewable sources now because of a policy push to, you know, basically, you know, solarize their economy. So it's possible. And, you know, these are wedges that kind of give you a sense. Lots of efficiency here. Here's some renewables. Nuclear sort of stays constant roughly. And you don't need any of these particular choices. They're out there. And economists are basically look at this, say, this could be free. There was a recent report that basically said we would make money if we did this because we'd be saving so much energy use from conventional sources to costing maybe 1, 2, 3% of global GDP. So it's affordable. Wouldn't break the bank. You know, it's an issue, though. It's a huge investment problem. So that's the good news. And so, again, policy is about where are we going to be here? You know, here's where we're going to go normally. Policy is designed to sort of change that trajectory. Okay, and again, good news. So here's a headline from the Financial Times. U.S. solar and wind actually competitive with natural gas. So we're seeing actually that most of the new investment in electric infrastructure right now is going into renewables. China, actually their coal imports actually dropped for the first time in 10 years last month. And they've made a policy commitment to cap their coal use, and depends on, will they get there fast enough. So there's good news out there. All right, so where do we stand as a country in terms of that diagram? What are we committed to, and how are we going to get there? So I'll give you a little bit of primer on U.S. climate policy. It starts with surprisingly enough, with the Clean Air Act back in 1970. And this was a law that was passed before anybody was thinking about except for maybe a handful of people, were thinking about global warming as an environmental problem. And it was designed to solve our basic, urban air quality problems. So smog, particulates, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide emissions, just to clean up the air that people were breathing in cities. It went into effect. It's been extremely effective. Our air in urban areas in the United States much cleaner than it was when I was 10 years old back in 1970, but wasn't really having to do with global warming. In 1988, and actually, it wasn't until 1988 that an awareness about global warming as a reality began to seep into the general public consciousness. That was when Jim Hansen first testified in Congress saying it was here. I certainly didn't know about it. I mean, I was in college. I didn't learn a thing about global warming. And 1987, I started to think a little bit about it. 1988, it became real. By 1992, there was global concern, and there was a conference in Rio where a treaty called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, was developed and signed and ratified. So George Bush Sr. signed it, and the U.S. Senate ratified it. And among other things, it set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It set up a UN-sponsored scientific body that every 5 years tells us the state of the science and confirms that it's getting worse and worse, and we need to do something about it. So that's their function. But it also, at that time, everybody agreed to try voluntarily to hold their global warming pollution levels at 1990 levels, to not let them grow. And that didn't work. So U.S. emissions rose something like 20% over the decade. And so in 1998, the other thing that the Rio Convention, the UNFCCC set up was an ongoing process. So there's the conference of the parties every 2 years. They meet and try and strengthen the treaty, evaluate it, strengthen it if necessary. So in 1988, there was a thing called the Kyoto Treaty that emerged out of the UNFCCC process. And this was a treaty that actually, where the nations who signed it actually committed to reductions, roughly 5 to 7% below 1990 levels by 2 years ago, 2012. All right. U.S. actually signed that treaty, as did the European nations, the Russians, Japanese, Canadians. Looked like we're going to get serious about this. But really only the Europeans abided by the treaty. They actually met the commitments for the Kyoto Accord. They set up a European-wide cap-and-trade system. Everybody else kind of blew it off. The U.S., George Bush, formally pulled us out of Kyoto in 2001. It was never ratified by the Senate. And the Canadians and the Japanese and the Australians all pretty much ignored it as well. But the Europeans, as I said, actually committed to it, and they actually tightened their commitments through 2020. So basically what happened was 1988 looked like there was going to be progress, but it didn't happen. George W. Bush was elected in 2000. No interest at the federal level for any kind of, or no appetite for action on climate change. And then something funny happened in 2007, which is that the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, excuse me, where we are right now, and a number of other states decided to sue the EPA and say that under the way that the Clean Air Act of 1970 was written, the EPA was legally mandated to require reductions in global warming pollution, in greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide primarily. Now, again, no one had envisioned this problem when the Clean Air Act was written, but it said that the EPA is required to maintain, a safe level of a safe atmosphere to reduce any pollutants that are harmful in the atmosphere. And state of Massachusetts argued that, well, carbon dioxide is creating this heat trapping blanket. It's dangerous to people, and so EPA should start to require people to reduce those emissions. And the Supreme Court agreed. And as a consequence, the Supreme Court ordered Bush's EPA to begin regulating carbon dioxide emissions. Now, Bush's EPA didn't want to do that, and they were kind of kicking and screaming, but they were the court said, sorry, you have to do it, and so they started the process, okay? Now, in 2008, you had sort of a major political shift. So you had the election of President Obama, you had election of a clean energy, let's not make it Democratic, clean energy majority in the House, because there were a number of Republicans who ultimately supported the, well, not a number, there were a few Republicans who ultimately supported the cap and trade bill. And a clean energy majority, almost a supermajority in the Senate. So it looked like the U.S. was going to sort of sidestep the Clean Air Act and actually pass a bill that was going to require a shrinking cap on carbon emissions, so cap it and then require it to be reduced every year. And the House of Representatives did that in 2008, but the Senate failed to pass a companion bill. And I think if Ted Kennedy hadn't have died when he did, we actually would have gotten a bill out of the Senate too. But when Kennedy died, Scott Brown became senator here. He was opposed to climate action. The supermajority kind of disappeared, and that one vote was pretty much enough to doom action in the Senate. Then in 2010, you had Tea Party gaining control of the House, so the House flipped, and really now global warming legislation is no longer an option at the federal level, at least until the composition of the House of Representatives changes. So 2016, 2018, 2020, whatever. So we're really kind of stuck with the Clean Air Act as our policy instrument at the federal level. One other thing to note is that as a consequence of the stimulus spending in 2009 to get us out of the recession, there was a boatload of money that went to clean energy. And this had a big effect and really helped sort of catalyze the rapid growth of the solar industry in the U.S., which, along with what Germany's doing and other countries, has really led to a precipitous decline in solar prices, again, also because of the Chinese involvement. So, there's really good progress that's emerged as a result of policy that isn't about sort of a cap on emissions. It's about sort of subsidies for clean energy technologies. So with the Obama administration in place, more of an appetite for, pretty serious regulation of emissions. Obama pledged at Copenhagen at the international meetings that the U.S. would cut emissions 17% below 2006 levels by 2020. And so what the EPA has done is that in 2012, and the Clean Air Act takes a while to gear up. Remember, it was 2007 that the EPA was ordered to do something, and it wasn't until 2012 that they actually got around to doing something. So it takes a while. And in fact, all they said was that by 2025, the average fleet fuel economy in the vehicle fleet has to be 54.5 miles per gallon. So if you sell vehicles in the United States, on average, you've got to have 54.5 miles per gallon. Some are going to be better than that, others are going to be worse than that, but that's got to be your average. Now, this is not rocket science, right? Toyota Prius gets better than that already, but basically it's going to move the whole fleet in that direction. Big effect, big reductions in emissions, basically having the impact of the vehicle fleet on CO2, at least not taking into account rebound effects. Last year, EPA finalized regulations for new power plants and basically said you can't build a new coal plant in the United States unless it actually captures the carbon dioxide that comes out of the stack and then injects it underground in a way that it can't escape. And no one really knows how to do that yet. So at this point, new coal plants are pretty much off the table as a consequence of the EPA regulations. And that's a switch, because if you think back to 2005, there was this sort of huge rush to build 50 new coal plants. And so that was an important victory that sort of has emerged over the last decade. But then right now, the EPA has proposed regulations for existing power plants. targeting 30% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030, and probably meeting Obama's goal. Existing power plants account for 40% of U.S. global warming pollution, so this is also a big deal. So if we think about that trajectory that we have to be on, as a if we're going to hit this 450 parts per million, it's not quite. It's about basically about halfway between business as usual and where we need to be. All right, but it's important. We're definitely bending the curve, and so it really is important policy. Now, how are they doing this? Well, under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act, the EPA is required to identify the, quote, best system of emission reduction adequately demonstrated that is available to limit pollution and set guidelines for states to achieve reductions that reflect that system. States then make plans to get the reductions that would result from that system. So let me unpack that a little bit. What it says is that the EPA is supposed to figure out, given the available technologies that are out there to reduce CO2 emissions, how much Massachusetts can effectively do, or cost effectively do, how much Wyoming can cost effectively do, how much Ohio can cost effectively do. Set targets for each of the states based on their technical analysis of what's possible, right? And then each state has to come up with an implementation plan to meet that target. They don't have to do it the way the EPA envisioned they might, but they have to do it in one way or another. And if they don't, then the EPA has the legal authority to take over the state process and sort of mandate their own. Now, would they actually do that? Who knows? This is kind of a Federalist question, but that's the way the process works. So here's how it looks for New York State, for example. EPA decided that New York State, by 2030, needs to reduce their power sector emission rate by 44%. So what that means is that right now, in New York State, there's a certain amount of electricity that's being produced, and that's generating a certain amount of CO2. So the CO2 per unit per kilowatt hour of power needs to go down 44%. So for every kilowatt hour of power produced, there's got to be 44% less pollution associated with that by 2030. And the EPA figured that this would come roughly 1% from an increased efficiency of coal plants. So getting more energy out of a given amount of coal that you're burning. 14.5% by relying more on natural gas combined cycle plants, the cleanest natural gas plants when there's excess capacity available in the system. 18% with renewables and nuclear. And then 11% from reduced electricity demand by using electricity more efficiently. So that's the roadmap on which the EPA decided to come up with this sort of number. And again, every state's got a different number. Some states it's as low as 10 to 20% reduction. Some 3 states it's over 50%. So how are the different states going to meet this goal? And I'm going to talk about New York, and Massachusetts actually fits into this cap as well. Interestingly enough, the New England states, and formerly New Jersey, and probably New Jersey again sometime soon, are members of a thing called RGGI. How many of you know about RGGI? Okay. RGGI is a great name. If I was going to name a policy something, I would call it RGGI. So RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and it's actually a cap and trade system for electric power producers in the New England states, plus New York. So what that means is that if you're a power producer in New England and you're emitting carbon dioxide pollution out of your stacks, if you're emitting 1,000 tons, you've got to have permits for each ton. You've got to have 1,000 permits allowing you to emit that pollution. And you have to buy those permits at auction. And there's a certain number of them available, and that number actually shrinks every year. Okay? And so as a consequence, the price of those emissions rises as the number available shrinks, and it becomes much more, you get incentivized to figure out ways to reduce your emissions rather than buy permits. Okay, so that's how a cap and trade system works. You can buy permits from your neighbors, and if you reduce more than you need, if people have excess permits, but that's sort of the basic story. And so, in a way, the New England states have already got a mechanism in place to meet the EPA's requirements. All they have to do is sync up RGGI's emission reductions with what is mandated for by the EPA for each state, and kind of they're done, right? Then it's up to the different power producers to figure out how they're going to meet the standards. One of the features of RGGI is that most of the states actually use the money that comes from selling those permits to invest in energy efficiency and reducing electricity demand, and in particular, thinking about the impact on low-income households, because as electricity prices rise, that can impose a burden, especially on low-income folks. So you can, for example, create programs that weatherize low-income houses, or perhaps provide subsidies or assistance to low-income families to help them cope with somewhat higher electricity bills. This isn't huge, but you know, it's real. Okay, so you know, in reality, that's sort of a simple approach. Now, because the states have different targets, it's not going to work perfectly, but RGGI is sort of a major instrument to achieve this. And one of the interesting features is that one way that other states, including New Jersey, down to the Midwest, now could actually join RGGI, right, as a primary means of their state implementation plan. And so one of the effects of the Clean Air Act, possibly, would be to create large regional cap and trade systems as a way of complying with the EPA's mandate. So even though Congress was not able to pass a cap and trade system in 2008, it may be that one is going to emerge as RGGI expands in the East and California's trading system expands in the West. So, you know, that's one possibility. And, you know, other options, carbon taxes. Right now, there's a Citizens Climate Lobby in Washington, D.C. has been advocating for the EPA to include carbon taxes as an instrument that states could use in their state implementation plans. Right now, it's not possible, but certainly is one tool that states could implement to say, we're going to impose a carbon tax of, let's say, $20 a ton, and we think that will get us this much emission reduction. That's part of our state implementation plan. So that'd be another strategy states could use. And basically what's happening is that this is a really interesting policy, sort of federalism policy fight, and NGOs are gearing up to really get involved. And it's important because so much of the action is at the state level right now, of what's actually how the states are really going to do this. And states can actually go beyond the targets that the EPA set. They don't have to stop there. So this is a really important opportunity for citizens to get involved, to comment, to get organized, to lobby, to you know, go towards their state regulators and say, you know, we think you can be more aggressive than that, and here's some great ideas as ways to do it. Because what happens in the leading states is really sets a pattern for the lagging states because they don't have the infrastructure and the capacity and the staff to figure out how to do this. So they tend to look towards the states that have better regulatory systems as a way to follow. So it's a really important moment for citizens to get involved with your, you know, whatever's your mass League of Conservation Voters or your, I don't know what the big, you know, green groups are that affect state policy here. But it's a very kind of key moment. Citizen engagement time. So just kind of summing up, getting back to, you know, the work we do, you know, there's really, again, two ways that we're going to figure this out. One way is changing the rules and figuring out how we're going to lay the foundation for a new economy. And that's a really important skill set. And we need people who can think of these smart policies and figure out how to implement them and work with the stakeholders to get them through. And then, of course, we need people who want to play the game, right? And say, okay, states saying we have to reduce emissions by 45%. That's creating a lot of opportunity. It's creating a lot of business opportunity. How are we going to make money against that new policy framework and support the policy goals. And so those are the two graduate programs that we offer at Bard. The MS degrees in environmental policy and climate science and policy, where we teach you how to change the rules. And then the MBA in sustainability, where that's really a new kind of business school. There's only a handful of programs globally that are fully integrating this perspective into a business curriculum. How do you build a business that's actually designed not to make as much money as it can without breaking the law, which is what they teach in most business schools, right? But instead, how do I build a business that is designed to solve a social or environmental problem? And I could talk more about sort of what I mean by sustainable business. But boy, I ended it right on time for 45. That's pretty good. I got to say, I usually go way over. Well, thank you for listening, and we got lots of time for questions, I guess. Yeah, great. And before we go, let me be sure I tell you my #1 secret on how to get a job this summer. So that's got to happen sometime. I'll let you call it. Okay, questions? Comments? Yeah. 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 It's just power plants. So it's not like oil refineries and other big emitters. California's policy actually includes industrial sources. But yeah. Oh, I got to repeat the question. Okay. Yeah.
How the RGG works? I mean, they are allowed to, let's say, fly and together the carbon emission together. Is it something like a trading pool between them?
So the question is, how does RGGI work? So in principle, the way RGGI works is that on I think a quarterly basis, they have an auction of permits. So and you literally go online and you say, I want to buy this many permits. I think they set the price. You buy the permits, and then if at the end of the quarter you don't have enough permits, you got to go buy them from somebody else. The states sell them initially. And then if I'm a business and I need more or I don't have enough, then I buy from a business that has more than they need. And that price can be negotiated. Yeah.
With RGGI, we talk about fishing villages in
yeah.
And how they had quotas
yes.
about fishing and they were trading
yep.
one business.
Yep.
Is there a similar quota?
Absolutely. These are called ITQs, transferable quota, individual transferable quota. So yeah, you can use these cap and trade mechanisms in a variety of circumstances. And they have some real benefits. They have some weaknesses as well. And the main one is that you really have to have a good monitoring system so that you actually, people aren't gaming the system. And you also got to be able to enforce if people violate the quotas or don't have the number of permits. They have to be hit with pretty steep fines for the system to work effectively. But if you've got good monitoring and enforcement, then the systems will work pretty well. And they're flexible so that people don't get punished kind of for arbitrary reasons. They can always go find some quota somewhere else if they need it. Yeah.
I think it was called Section 111 or maybe
Chapter
111. You mentioned that the EPA was considering the state's economic feasibility of ordering the states to reduce their emissions by whatever amount. Does the Clean Air Act require that the EPA consider economic impact?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not. So the question is, does the Clean Air Act require that the EPA consider economic impact?
And does it actually prohibit either one of
Yes.
those?
Right. The Clean Air Act requires the EPA to ensure a safe level of pollutants in the atmosphere. To ensure there's no more than a safe level of pollutants in the atmosphere. But it gives the agency a lot of leeway to get there. And in principle, they cannot use a cost-benefit test. So cost-benefit analysis is explicitly ruled out for deciding how far to go with the Clean Air Act. However, the EPA cannot mandate unrealistic requirements on industry. So I think it was the best. What is it called? The best emission response system or something? Yeah. Yeah, I can go back. So if I can I go back? Oh, there we go. Oh, wrong way. It's the best system of emission reduction adequately demonstrated. So that means it's got to have someone who's actually had to install it and use it, and it works, and that it's obviously not economically prohibitively expensive, or people wouldn't have done it. So they're basically looking for best practices, and then require everybody to do that. And then there's probably a second round, typically, where after everybody's done that, you then go back and say, okay, now let's do something else. So there's sort of an incremental process by which the EPA can move towards ratcheting stuff down. But what we're talking about now is, that'll be a while down the road. So it's really, round one is going to take us through 2030, right, is the goal. Yeah. Yep.
And that was going to be mandated to the top, and it was going to be a stick approach.
Yep.
And had that works, then there would be a push to find these best
yep.
technology. Now we have the other side that is as technologies become available, you're forced to use them. And when you think about this more globally, what we're trying to do is this top-down, we'll set the rules, you figure it out. And I imagine that a lot of the concerns that there are all kinds of different concerns from the parties, but some of the concern is, I don't want to agree to something that I'm not sure how to do realistically. So is there any way to take this approach and go back to the time of the issue that you'll be mandating best available technologies or technologies rather than saying, we're going to set a limit, you have to figure it out? And what are the advantages or disadvantages of going, push or pull?
Let me back up to your question here, because I didn't quite finish it, and I'll get to yours. In spite of the fact that you can't legally use cost-benefit analysis in considering the standards set by the Clean Air Act, under an executive order from Reagan, and it's been continued by every president since, the EPA is required to do a cost-benefit analysis of any regulation costing over $100 million. Now, it just so happens that virtually any air regulation you can imagine has huge benefits relative to costs, because you're getting all kinds of co-benefits associated with this. So you're reducing all sorts of conventional air pollutants. So you get big health benefits associated with what they're doing. And this one passes a cost-benefit analysis test with flying colors. In fact, cost-benefit analysis would say you should go a lot further. So that's kind of just a secondary conversation. So your question is, this is not, sometimes people kind of contrast, we'll just set a limit, industry figure it out. That's kind of a tax or cap and trade system, versus a command and control system where state regulators mandate certain emission technologies. That's not really what this is. What this is saying is, okay, states, you come up with a plan that's kind of sectoral in nature. It might have a cap and trade system in it. It might have a tax in it. So there's a lot of flexibility built into what the states can do here. The EPA just said, here's what we think you can achieve based on currently existing technologies. Now you guys come back with a story about how it's going to work. So it is a very kind of collaborative, it's not really a sort of a stick kind of, you must use this technology thing yet. I mean, it might lead to that in certain, they may prohibit certain practices, certain technologies, they must require certain things of coal companies, that sort of thing. Yeah.
What kind of tools does the EPA have to put the penalty on states that still abide by these regulations? I assume that there are plenty of conservative states that haven't done anything.
Yeah, and there's a number of things that can be done. So, in the worst case, the EPA can federalize the state policy and just say, okay, we're going to do the plan for you, and, we have legal authority to require people to do stuff, and we will. That is probably unlikely to happen. There would be some negotiated process with the states whereby the EPA would threaten to do that, and then the states would react, and they'd say, "Here's our," so there'd be a compromise. So it's like it's a federal system, and so a lot of the action has to happen at the states, which is why it's so important for progressive states to demonstrate how well this can be done and how cheaply this can be done and how effectively it can be done, so that the laggard states just have a hard time kind of arguing with the EPA. And the good news is, in the more progressive states, that's where most of the people live, and that's where most of the pollution is. So it really doesn't matter that much if Wyoming doesn't comply. For this particular issue, or it takes them a long time to comply. Yeah.
You said the EPA recommended we're at 17% reduction by 2000.
Yeah.
You know what we're kind of projecting to get for 2017, or what we're at right now?
I think because of the recession and the switch to natural gas and the kind of cramming in of renewables over the last 6 or 7 years, I think it's probably close to 8% or maybe 9% below 2006 levels now. So we're sort of halfway there even before we got started. So we did sort of peak in 2007, and we've been on a sort of bumpy kind of big drop and then sort of stabilized, I believe. I don't think we went back up last year. Oh, your question was, and the question was, where is the U.S. at right now? So, yeah. Other questions? Questions about graduate school, careers, how do I get a job?
How are you going to get a job this summer?
How to get a job this summer, okay. I'll tell you, so first, does anybody know where they want to be this summer? Location-wise. Okay, Bermuda. All right, what do you want to be doing in Bermuda? If you want to work, I'm assuming you want to work there. Okay, you want to do paid research. All right. Okay, well, it works for this as well, okay? So, go on the web, find the 3 people in Bermuda who are doing the coolest research around, what kind of research do you want to do? Okay, doing the most cool marine conservation stuff in Bermuda, right? And get their emails, and that might take a little work. You might have to call somebody and, sort of figure that out. And send them an email and say, I'm a student at Tufts University, and I'm writing an article for our student newspaper about leadership in the marine conservation field in Bermuda. And I'd love to interview you, right? And everybody loves to be interviewed about an article about leadership, right? So they'll say, sure, that's fine, right? So you interview them, you write the article, and then you send them a link. And they get to see what a great writer you are and how thoughtful you are and how analytical you are. And they'll send it to their mom, right? And then when they write back and say, well, thanks, a good article, then you get to say, okay, and by the way, I'm coming to Bermuda this summer, and I'd really interested in work in this space. Could we have coffee or something? So sort of a general clue about networking is that you always want to give something before you ask for something. And that's just a general clue about life, right? And one thing you can give as a young person, as a student, certainly is the ability to give exposure to other people's ideas, especially in this environment where we're all, potentially journalists and bloggers, right? So if you don't have a place to publish that, you can always just send it to us. We'll publish it on our blog at Bard EcoReader. So that's my number 1 tip for effective networking, getting the job you want in the place you want it. Okay? And that reminds me, I did want to mention before we run out of time, that I would like to invite you all to come to Bard to actually learn more of these secrets. We run this organization called the C2C Fellows Program, and it really is designed to this question of, okay, we have this incredible challenge that we're facing. This is, again, it's serious business. That curve is very scary, and we have to figure out how to bend it. So how do you do that? How do you gain the skills that you need, for example, in developing a vision, knowing what you're good at, telling your story, raising money, building a network? So come to Bard for the weekend, December 5th through 7th. You'll be meeting with 50, 60 other people, students, recent graduates from across the Northeast, and we'll spend the weekend working on that stuff together. It's $30. Registration fee covers food and lodging. We'll send you an announcement. You can pass it around to everybody here, and we'd love to see you then for more conversation about that. Yeah? Okay.
And Steve Buckley is asking, why do you think New Jersey was joining RTI?
Because they were already in it. I mean, it would have to be post-Christie. So if Christie runs for president, which everyone's presuming he will, and he either does well, in which case he's no longer governor of New Jersey, or he does really poorly, in which case it doesn't really matter if he rejoins Reggie. You know, all of his DEC people are going to be saying, look, the simplest way for us to do this and most cost effective and the easiest thing for industry is just to rejoin Reggie. Because he pulled out for explicitly political reasons. He wanted to set himself up, you know, to run for president in the Republican Party, and then he needed to engage the Tea Party folks who, you know, don't believe in global warming.
So let's take even one more time.
Yeah.
Forward, talk to some more
Yeah.
about some literature. Thank you again for coming, and I hope to see you again next week.
Yeah, I'm glad to talk further about our graduate programs.